Hello. Welcome back to the Gap Bible Series Seminar, the Anabaptist Immigration to Pennsylvania in the 18th Century with Thomas Martin. I'm David Blank, chair of the conference and its sponsoring board. This morning, Tom finishes up in two sessions titled God's Providential Care of the Anabaptist Refugees, followed by Lessons to be Learned from the Plain Community. Thank you for watching.
Good morning. We're going to continue now with our study of the Anabaptist Emigration to Pennsylvania in the 18th century, first by focusing in this hour upon God's providential care of the Anabaptist refugees, and then finally looking at some lessons we can learn from the plain community. One of the central texts of study by the Anabaptists, both in Europe and America, was the Sermon on the Mount. And you'll recall that Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, "Take no thought for your life, what you will eat or what you'll drink or how you'll be clothed. Is not the body more than clothing? Isn't life more than food? If God so clothes the grass of the field, which today is and tomorrow is cast into the oven, will he not much more clothe you, O ye of little faith? Consider the lilies, consider the birds of the air." The Anabaptists who came to Pennsylvania didn't know what they were coming to. We know that in 1710, one of the earliest, Martin Kendig, came with a group known as the Peckway Settlement and found a paradise, lovely soil, great resources, fresh water, unspoiled, game abundant, trees and all sorts of things that they could benefit from. Lancaster County has some of the finest soils in the world with 2 feet of topsoil. And this was unknown when the first emigres came to America. It was decided after a period of time that one of their number, Hans Herr, should return to Europe and give a report so that those who had stayed behind, not knowing what to expect, could now be brought over and would come, and they would know that all was well. But because Hans Herr, according to this tradition, which we're not sure is fully accurate, but it's been a long-standing tradition, because Hans Herr was the pastor of the small congregation which met in his house, we do have a contemporaneous document talking about the church which met at Hans Herr's house, that he should not go, but that rather they would send his friend and neighbor, Martin Kendig, back. And Martin did go back and brought back with him a large number of people, the largest group about 1717, one of whom was my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, Benjamin Whitmer. Now, this time in the first couple decades of the 18th century was a little different aside from the forest and the lack of roads and the lack of modern equipment, from what you might expect, because when people came from Europe to settle in inland Pennsylvania, I would have thought that they went from Philadelphia, perhaps along the Great Valley, into Lancaster County, but that apparently was not the way it was done. Someone recently published an article in the Lancaster Mennonite Quarterly in which it's shown that before 1720, the route would have been they would have come to Newcastle, Delaware, and then gone overland to the Octorara Creek and over that to almost to the Susquehanna and then northward into Lancaster County that way rather than directly west from Philadelphia. There were horses available. There weren't any roads, so that carts really couldn't be brought, but people would pack their horses and pack animals as best they could and come west. The world as we know it today consists of countries with borders, respected because of national territorial integrity. That seems to be a foundation of modern civilization. But that wasn't always the case. A series of bloody battles known as the 30 Years' War, which concluded in 1648 when 2 treaties were signed by the warring parties in 2 German towns in the region of Westphalia, established what today is the modern understanding of sovereign states. Prior to that year, princes and other rulers considered it their duty to impose their religion anywhere the armies could go. National boundaries didn't make any difference. By the Peace of Westphalia, the European powers agreed that within their respective territories, the religion of the locals would be determined by that country itself, No longer would Catholic and Protestant armies invade other countries to impose their religion or to interfere in internal affairs. Sometimes you hear today about countries like China saying you don't get involved in our internal affairs. Well, that dates back to 1648 when the Peace of Westphalia was instituted. Separation of church and state was an idea which had not yet been adopted. But at least territorial protection of religion in the country was protected against foreign invaders. France and Spain could be Roman Catholic. Germany and Scandinavia could be Lutheran. England, the Alsace, Geneva could be Calvinist, and all of them sovereign without fear of suffering aggression for religious reasons alone. Nowhere were the Anabaptists tolerated, however. By 1648, most of the Swiss brethren had fled north into the Palatinate, or east of the Rhine, where Calvinist rulers tolerated their nonconformity. They had been largely exterminated in Holland and Frisia. Where they were permitted to live, however, they had to remain cautious because at any time the government might change and be unwilling to further tolerate their divergent views. The Anabaptists who had fled from Switzerland introduced new measures of agriculture when they settled in Germany. In the Palatinate, the Mennonites introduced legumes such as clover and alfalfa in the context of a crop rotation system. Unlike previous practice, where hay was cut from untillable meadows and swamps, Mennonites planted these hay-producing crops on tillable soil, harvested their nitrogen-fixing legumes, and brought them to their cattle as feed. Consequently, more manure from the cattle was available to place on the fields as fertilizer. Mennonites also began the widespread use of gypsum and lime on unproductive land. Its calcium and sulfur clearly improved production. These specific practices, undertaken with a controlled rotation of crops, provided a tremendous boost to the fertility of the soil and the health of the animals. The consummate agricultural skills of Mennonites and Amish have long been recognized by the general public, and a few scholars have noted the phenomenon. Unfortunately, though, few historians have studied the origins of this important subject in any detail. The farming practices brought from Switzerland to southern Germany, then brought to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, still pertain in many cases today. The Europe of the medieval period was passing into the midst of history. In England, the son of a wealthy and influential naval officer, Sir William Penn, was born into high society in 1644. He was given the name of his father. Baptized in the Anglican Church of All Hallows by the Tower, he went to University of Oxford and even studied law for a year at Lincoln's Inn. Around 1650, George Fox had formed the Society of Friends, the Religious Society of Friends, as an alternative to the Church of England. He stressed an inner light in all men and strict adherence to denial of oaths and pacifism and avoidance of many other forms of what he considered worldliness. Some of these doctrines perhaps came to England by William Penn from the Anabaptists in Europe. Penn was dismissed from Oxford in 1662 for having his private devotions in his room rather than attending university chapel. So the next year his father sent him to study at the Reformed Saumur Academy in the Loire River Valley. Perhaps studying in France might teach the young man some civility and go to church when he was supposed to. His father probably hoped that, at least. The younger Penn spent about a year there, coming under the influence of Moses Amirault, the widely known theologian who carried on the Calvinist tradition in most areas except in the doctrine of the definite atonement. After later being sent to Ireland to oversee his father's estates, however, Penn came under the influence of Quaker teaching and eventually embraced those views. In 1667, he attached himself to the movement known to its opponents as Quakerism and to its adherents as the Religious Society of Friends. George Fox had begun preaching, and his ideas began to spread. Among them was the belief that government should not be involved in prescribing religion for the people, and simple Christian faith would advance and prosper on its own. The government wasn't needed to force people to worship, and the government shouldn't interfere with the way people worshipped. Penn wrote several defenses of the views of Fox, but for these he was jailed in the Tower of London in 1668 as punishment. After he was released, he began street preaching and was arrested again, this time sent to the infamous Newgate prison with violent criminals, the insane, the bankrupt, and wayward children. When Penn's father died, the crown owed him a small fortune. He had advanced significant sums to wage the wars on the seas which England had needed. So, seeking to resolve two problems at once, ridding his kingdom of the stubborn Quakers and satisfying the debt, he gave to William Penn a patent for a vast tract of land in the New World along the Delaware River. At that time, the New World had not yet been adequately surveyed, and the 40th parallel was considered to be the southern terminus of Penn's grant. However, the 40th parallel was north of Philadelphia. And so later, when Lord Calvert tried to establish his claims to Maryland, he demanded all the land which Penn had assumed was his, and a compromise wasn't reached until Mason and Dixon, 100 years later, ran their famous survey line. Penn had been offered a large sum of money for trading rights with the Native Americans who lived between the Delaware River and the Susquehanna. At the time, Penn needed money, but he declined the offer because he didn't want to interfere with the possibility of having a tranquil relationship with the Native Americans. In the letter to James Harrison, William Penn wrote, "For my country, I eyed the Lord in obtaining it, and more was I drawn inward to look to him, and to owe it to his hand and power, than to any other way. I have so obtained it, and desire to keep it, that I may not be unworthy of his love, but do that which may answer his kind providence, and serve his truth and his people, that an example may be set up to the nations. There may be room there, though not here in England, for such a holy experiment." Now that little phrase, holy experiment, contained in the August 25th, 1681 letter from William Penn, has been frequently repeated, perhaps the most commonly repeated phrase of William Penn in our day. But the word experiment has several different meanings. We kind of think of it as a chemistry experiment. If you add this chemical to this chemical, you get this reaction. But it's also used in the sense of experimental faith. You talk about people who have a faith which they experience. It changes their lives. It causes them to be more holy. And I think that's the sense in which Penn meant it. He used the phrase not in the scientific sense, but in the sense of experience, which is to be lived out. He wanted a holy experiment. He wanted an experience which was holy. He wanted to deal in kindness and honesty with Native Americans as well as his own Quaker friends, and purchase land from them in addition to the grant by the English crown. In 1682, Penn first visited his acquisition for 2 years to establish this holy experiment, where English nonconformists like Quakers and French Huguenots and Scotch-Irish Presbyterians in Ulster and Moravians and German Anabaptists and Swiss Anabaptists and refugees of all sorts could establish communities and live in peace regardless of their religious convictions. And this was a blessing of God, that at the exact time when so many Swiss Anabaptists were being forced out of their homeland, that William Penn said, "Come on over. Free land, no religious oppression. Practice your faith as you believe God would have you." In order to develop his colony, Penn needed industrious and honest settlers. And the Swiss brethren who had settled in the Rhineland seemed to be ideal candidates. You have to understand what was going on. The War of Spanish Succession had just ended, or it was just going on and then eventually ended. There had been famines in the Rhine Valley because of serious changes in weather. The refugees were in almost a hopeless plight. They couldn't go home, and yet they couldn't stay where they were. And just at that time, there was an invitation sent out from England to these refugees to come over to England, and we'll send you on to North America, and you'll find refuge there. I have another ancestor. I told you about my Swiss Anabaptist ancestor, Madame Ferret, who was a French Huguenot who had gone to the Rhineland and then also had gone to North America, and she settled up along the Hudson River. And I was curious for a time why it was that she then moved down to Lancaster County, how she had gotten to the Hudson Valley. Well, it seems that at the time, the colonial governor of New York had convinced the Queen Anne that she should send large numbers of these Germans who were flooding across the English Channel into England and creating migrant camps, much the way we've recently read about how many refugees have left France and come over the English Channel to seek to be able to live in England. Many of the Germans at the time and the Swiss who spoke the dialect of German had come to England, thousands, 30,000 as many has been estimated. And the English, at first it was kind of interesting. They were curious about these foreigners, But as more and more came, and as they kept coming, and there seemed to be no end to this migration, they said, well, we've got to do something with these. And the colonial governor of New York suggested, well, why don't we have them come to America? We'll settle them. We'll promise them, first of all, we'll promise them free land along the Hudson River, well north of New York City, New Amsterdam, which it had been. And we'll have them cut down some of the pine trees and create pitch for the Royal Navy. The English Royal Navy needed pitch to line their wooden ships. And that took a certain amount of determination to fell the pine trees and then to extract the pitch and then to refine it and then to ship it back to England. And this governor thought that would be a great idea, and Queen Anne thought that was good idea too. So large numbers of these German refugees were brought from England to New York, on the Hudson River, where they found out that the situation wasn't quite what they thought it was. First, they weren't given their free land, and secondly, many of them were pacifists and did not want to create pitch to help the Royal Navy because they thought they'd be promoting war. But they didn't speak up in England because then they wouldn't get to North America. They spoke up when they got to North America. The story is told in an article in the journal Pennsylvania History, a journal of Mid-Atlantic Studies in 1999. The author is Philip Utterness of Warren Wilson College, Penn State University Press, and the title of the article is 1709 Palatine Migration and the Formation of German Immigrant Identity in London and New York. And one of the interesting things I found about this story is the fact that when the Germans settled in the Alsace and in the Palatinate and in the Kraichgau, they had come from all sorts of different places. And remember, it was not a mobile society at the time. These were strangers who spoke different dialects, had different cultures, had different religions. Some of them were Catholics who were fleeing because of poverty. Some of them were Anabaptists who were fleeing because of religious persecution. Many of them didn't even know each other, but they heard, we've got to England, we'll be safe. So they got to England, set up these migrant camps. They were loaded on boats and sent to North America. And one of those was a woman by the name of, who goes by the name of Madame Foray. And Madame Foray came to Ulster County in New York, and then within a couple of years came down to Lancaster County. And I always wondered why it was she had left New York. Well, now I know, because she never wanted to go to New York, but that was the only place she could go. And she donated the little cemetery known as Carpenter Cemetery, which is along the Strasburg Railroad that runs between Strasburg and Paradise. You can still take that old railroad today, and you can see the little cemetery out in the field, and that was donated by her, and she's buried there. And every year there's a reunion of her descendants. Well, she's an ancestor of mine as well. But she was a French Huguenot. She was not Anabaptist. It just gives you some idea of the complexity. When the Anabaptists settled in the first real settlement in Lancaster County, it was known as the Peckway Settlement. It ran from present-day Strasburg west to present-day Willow Street. Madame Foray was granted, actually her son-in-law, Isaac Lefay, was granted a patent for land east of that Peckway Settlement. And so she was neighbors with the Anabaptists, but wasn't an Anabaptist herself. One of the most remarkable features of Penn's colony was the diversity of cultures and ethnicities. Language was a barrier already before the English and the Dutch and the Swedes and the Finns had settled along the Delaware River. Now, the largest and earliest mass migration, I said, of German-speaking immigrants to England came about 1709. I've told you it's been estimated that 30,000 people may have followed the rumor that Queen Anne was offering free passage to America and free land once they arrived. The accession to the throne of Queen Anne, who followed William and Mary, and who followed James II. These were all professing Protestants, but James II really was a closet Roman Catholic. He wanted the country to go back to Roman Catholicism. And yet, James II and William Penn were very close friends. They'd been raised together. And so when the Glorious Revolution of 1688 occurred, and James II was deposed and had to flee, and William and Mary took the throne from Holland, it created serious problems. And for a time, several years, William Penn's grant of the colony was retracted, taken away from him. He had to make 3 trips to America because he had to keep going back to England to defend his title to his colony after he spent a great deal of labor, spent a great deal of money to establish it. Large refugee camps developed outside the walls of London, as I've said, consisting of French Huguenots, Swiss Anabaptists, German Catholics, and others who had fled persecution. They were mostly farmers without trade skills and lacking financial resources, and they became a burden to society. And yet the Dutch Anabaptists became aware of the Swiss brethren who shared many of the same beliefs, struggling to get from the upper Rhineland up into Rotterdam, other ports where boats they could go to England, then get to England, and then get to America. They were so compassionate that they sent large sums of money. And we have records today of the amounts of money and the people who received them, including some of my ancestors, so that they could afford to come across the Atlantic Ocean. Most of the ship captains insisted either that you pay cash up front or you agree to become an indentured servant once you arrived in the New World to pay off the debt of the ship's passage. Some French Huguenots could settle in England because they had trade skills, lace making, etc. If they could learn the language and adapt to the Church of England style of worship. They had fled their homeland after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, and they settled only temporarily in the Palatinate. Others were Swiss Anabaptists who had struggled for 100 years for religious tolerance by the Reformed Church, hoping to return to their homeland, but never to see it happen. They had only occasional success, and returning after banishment was a risky proposition. The British government finally agreed to provide 10 ships to America in exchange for labor for those who were transported once they arrived. Most refused to become indentured servants. They were being asked to make pine tar from forests of pine in upstate New York. One of the settlers lent his teenage son, Conrad Weiser, to live with the Iroquois for a year because there were Native Americans in New York as well as in Pennsylvania. And there had to be some way to understand and communicate with them. Conrad Weiser has become somewhat of a legend. His homestead still exists up in Berks County. You can go and visit it. He became a valuable asset both in keeping the peace with the Iroquois and helping translate negotiations for peace treaties with them. Sailing the Atlantic in the 18th century was never easy. The voyage usually took about 2.5 months, sometimes as long as 4.5 months. The food was meager and tasted poor. The company was rude and foul-smelling. The ride was stormy and difficult. One entry in the Pennsylvania Gazette for December 25, 1744, mentions danger from French pirates who had robbed poor refugees of what little they had. They were also in constant danger that whales would upend the ship. Winds were often contrary. The wooden foremast of ships sometimes would break in two. Imagine your plight if you're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and your main mast breaks. You have to somehow sew it back together and hope that it'll support the sails. Hardships on the Atlantic were many. In February 8, 1732, an issue of the Pennsylvania Gazette, which had been begun in 1728 by Benjamin Franklin, continued even to recent days as the Saturday Evening Post, printed this, quote, "There is a letter in town from some Palatines who embarked at Rotterdam in June last in a ship bound for this place, but instead arrived at Martha's Vineyard, an island on the coast of New England, containing an account that the ship being 24 weeks in her passage, their provisions fell short, and in the last 8 weeks they had no bread, but a pint of grouse was all the allowance for 5 persons per day. They ate all the rats and mice they could catch, and the price of a rat was 18 pence, of a mouse 6 pence, and of water 6 pence a quart. That 7 persons died of hunger and thirst in one night, and of 150 passengers which came on board at Rotterdam, over 100 were miserably starved to death. When at length it pleased God that a sloop should meet them, and conducted the ship into Holmes Hole, a harbor off Martha's Vineyard. In the first 3 days after their arrival, 15 more died, who had been reduced so low by famine that it was impossible to recover them. They write further that they think if they had continued at sea 3 days longer, they all would have died, no one being able to hand another drop of water. But the good people of the island are very charitable to refresh them, so that many who were famished and near death began to revive, but none are yet strong enough to travel." passage was hard across the Atlantic. And yet one has to look at the sufferings of people in our day. We all know others who have suffered. We've suffered ourselves in some ways. And we look to the goodness of God in sustaining us. And of course, for the believer, death is not an end, but a beginning of eternal life. One of the earliest German-speaking immigrants to Pennsylvania was a man named Francis Daniel Pistorius, who organized the German-speaking colony at Germantown in 1683. He arrived as an agent for the Frankfurt Company. His experience was much the same as those who followed him in the early 18th century. Pistorius later wrote to friends in Germany of his trip, and his letter was printed as a sort of promotional tract. He wrote, quote, "I desire nothing more in my little corner of the earth than to walk in the footsteps of him who is the way, and to follow his holy teachings, because he is the truth, in order that I may forever enjoy with him eternal life. The voyage is certainly dangerous on account of the terror of shipwreck, and very unpleasant on account of the bad and hard fare, so that I now, from my own personal experience, understand in a measure what David says in the 107th Psalm, that on the sea one may observe and perceive not only the wonderful works of God, but also the spirit of the storm." Pistorius wrote almost all the passengers were seasick for some days. I underwent 2 accidents. The 2 carved lugs over the ship's bell fell right upon my back, and during a storm in the night I fell so severely upon my left side that for some days I had to keep to my bed. These 2 falls reminded me forcibly of the first fall of our original parents in paradise, which has come down upon all their posterity, and also of many of those falls which I have undergone in this vale of misery of my exile. But praised be the fatherly hand of the divine mercy, which lifts us up again so many times and holds us back, that we fall not entirely into the abyss of the evil one. He also wrote, quote, "The rations upon the ship were very bad. Every 10 persons received 3 pounds of butter a week, 4 cans of beer, 2 cans of water a day, 2 platters full of peas every noon, meat 4 dinners in the week, and fish 3, and these we were obliged to prepare with our own butter. Also, we must every noon save up enough that we might get our supper from it." Excuse me a second. The worst of all was that both of the meat and the fish were salted to such an extent and it's become so rancid that we could hardly eat half of them. A Reformed minister, Samuel Goulden, came to America aboard the same ship, the Mary Hope, as a member of the Swiss Brethren, and was with her brothers, Christian and Hans Herr, in the summer of 1710. He wrote of the dangers of the voyage as follows, quote, "The tempestuous ocean, the hidden cliffs and sandbanks, the roving sea robbers and pirates, but especially the unhealthy ship's food, intolerable to many, through which the people easily sicken and die, were only some of the difficulties." He relates in his diary how in British waters they collided with 3 ships, killing 1 boy. 7 French warships suddenly appeared, throwing the crew into a panic all night. The ship was rocking and rolling and was stuck on a sandbank in the Delaware River. It took them a full week to navigate up the Delaware Bay to Philadelphia. Now, the entry point of Pennsylvania in the early 18th century was Germantown for the German-speaking population, a settlement that was then a separate town northwest of Philadelphia, but of course today it's part of the city of Philadelphia. In 1683, 13 families emigrated to Germantown. Its founders, descended from recent Dutch immigrants to Germany, were as much Dutch as they were German. They were subscribers and investors in the Frankfurt Company, and they took up residence in Philadelphia. The Frankfurt Company was an investment company, which at the time was hoping to make money by flipping land in the New World. Pistorius was a leader of that group. Although raised a Lutheran, he had joined its pietist wing and began to espouse views which aligned him very much with English-speaking Quakers. Understand, this is 200 years after Luther had basically founded the Protestant Reformation. And during that 200 years, the Lutheran Church had divided in a number of ways. It had become very cold, distant, orthodox in doctrine, but no real experience. And so there grew up in that context a number of groups which were much more interested in living spiritual lives, being in tune with the Word of God, and they were often known as pietists. Pistorius signed the first anti-slavery in the world, first anti-slavery petition in the world in 1688. He became a bailiff, that is the mayor of Germantown, and a member of the Colonial Pennsylvania Assembly. It's not surprising that when the Germans and the Swiss arrived, they settled mostly in what today is Pennsylvania, because in New York and in East Jersey and in Maryland and in Virginia, there were established churches which they would have had to participate in. In all likelihood, the king wanted the Anabaptists to settle west of the English settlements as sort of a buffer between the Native Americans and the English settlers. This was the same reason why the disfavored Scotch-Irish Presbyterians were invited to settle west of the Susquehanna River and along the Cumberland Valley. The earliest settlement in Lancaster County, as I've said, occurred in the fall of 1710. At that time, Lancaster was still part of Chester County, and there were panthers wandering among the wild, thick overgrowth. In April that year, Penn wrote to the ambassador of the Netherlands telling him that a small group of Mennonites would be coming to Holland on their way to Pennsylvania, and in June 1710, they in turn wrote to Mennonite leaders in Amsterdam thanking them for their financial assistance which had been provided. They were expecting to set sail in July of 1710 on the ship Maria Hope. The letter was signed by Martin Oberholzer, Martin Kendig, Jacob Müller, Martin Miley, and brothers Christian and Hans Herr. The ship arrived September 23rd, and on October 8th, warrants for conveyance of land were issued to them and to others. That region, which now is called Lancaster County, was well west of the frontier. But the Anabaptist settlers didn't care. They were farmers. They wanted to cut down trees and build buildings. They wanted to plant seeds and grow crops. And most of all, they wanted to worship as their consciences dictated to them. The water of the Peckway Creek was cold and clear and abundant in trout. The soil was rich and limestone-based and covered with sugar maples, hickory, black and English walnut trees. The settlers were blessed with a perfect location to begin their farms. And each successive year after 1710, a few of the Swissers came from the Palatinate, joining their compatriots in the new settlement. A large tract east of the Anabaptist settlement was taken up by Isaac Lefevre, the son-in-law of Madame Mary Ferret, who I mentioned earlier. The largest single migration of Mennonites in North America in history happened in 1770. Church leaders in Rotterdam reported in April that year that 300 Mennonites were in the city awaiting passage. A Dutch resident reported that 200 men from Switzerland and the Palatinate there had requests for travel funds to pay for the passage. The group arrived in Philadelphia in August of 1717, and my ancestor Benedict Vidmar, or Benjamin Whitmer, was among them. A list of the Mennonite immigrants has not survived, but from other sources we know the names of some of them. Whitmer surveyed 300 lands in what's now East Lampeter Township. If you know where the East Town Mall is, where Route 283 and Old Route 30 come together, that was right in the heart of the land which Whitmer was given. Now, the Native Americans east of the Mississippi River seem to have been two branches or stocks. There was the Algonquin family, and there was the Iroquois, and the Iroquois, I guess it's pronounced, which is a French name. The Algonquin family included all of what lived along the Atlantic coast, from Labrador to Georgia, as well as those who lived between the Great Lakes and the Ohio River. In New Jersey and Pennsylvania, they're called the Lenape, or the Delaware Indians. The other family, the Iroquois, who lived in Ontario, western New York, and northern Pennsylvania, down the Susquehanna Valley, and about to the northern edge of the Chesapeake Bay, they were almost surrounded by the Algonquins. But they were not of the same tribe and the same language and the same customs, and they often made war one against the other. The Dutch and the Swedes who settled along the Delaware River were the first to interact with Native Americans in the mid-Atlantic region. Dealing with the Algonquin, they became rivals in trade and purchase of land rights to the Susquehanna natives, known to them as the Minquas. A great beaver road, or beaver's reed, was used by the Europeans to trade. It generally followed what today is the Strasburg Road, about half a mile from where I'm standing, which passes just south of Gap. About 1607 and 1608, Captain John Smith of Virginia had made several voyages up the Chesapeake Bay to explore, and he had encountered some of the locals. So this Anabaptist meeting of the local Native Americans was not the first time they had had any contact, but it's unlikely that Smith traveled any further north than Port Deposit, Maryland. There are records of an early English fort built 3 miles north of the mouth of the present Conestoga Creek on the Susquehanna River. but no remains of it are known. Maryland's Chesapeake Bay shores were settled before Pennsylvania, and strife between the locals and the Maryland officials caused some difficulty involving the Native Americans as well. The Swedes were more kind in dealing with the locals, yet interaction among the Susquehannocks, as the natives were called, the Dutch, the Swedes, French Jesuit missionaries who moved southward, and the English, and even other natives, provoked many understandings and rivalries. It was Penn's desire to establish peace treaties with all the Native Americans. Remember, he was a pacifist as a Quaker. He didn't want to hurt anyone. There are records of the first Native American who died at the hands of an Englishman, and the whole council was held in the city of Philadelphia, and witnesses were brought in, and the perpetrators were arrested. It was an accident. It was unintentional. It was because the Native American had become intoxicated with alcohol, but it was a big deal, and peace was arranged by the English, taking seriously the fact that one of the Native Americans had died. The tradition that William Penn met with Native Americans in October 1682 may have an historical basis. There was later a painting done of that, and a wampum belt was given to the Pennsylvania Historical Society later by one of Penn's descendants. We'll stop there because not much of that gets into the Anabaptist theology. Let me mention briefly the Amish emigration to Pennsylvania. I've said the first Amish to settle in Pennsylvania were likely in 1736. Some of the families were the Detweilers and the Siebers. Over the course of the 1700s, about 500 Amish settlers arrived. Areas of Berks County were first settled. Common names among them were Fisher, Hirschberger, Hertzler, Huckstetler, Kaufman, King, Lance, Miller, Spiker, Troyer, Yoder, and Zug. They easily represent the names from the old country as well as the Amish in America. The first Lancaster County Amish settlement came soon after. It was known as Old Conestoga. It was at the mouth of the Conestoga River, where it joins the Susquehanna. But as time passed, all those Amish families appear to have moved other places. And while they may have scattered Amish folk in northern and eastern county, there were no settlements as such. The Amish settled generally in Somerset County, the Lebanon Valley, and present-day Mifflin County. In 1742, a number of Germans stated to the General Assembly they'd emigrated to Pennsylvania by the invitation of the proprietor, and they'd been brought up and were attached to Amish doctrines, and they were conscientiously scrupulous against taking oaths, and therefore could not be naturalized. But a law was passed allowing them to be naturalized in conformity with their conscience. In Europe, the Amish may have used special buildings for worship, but by and large, the Amish in America then and the Old Order Amish today only use houses and barns for their meetings. I'm going to stop there because that pretty much covers the entrance into the New World by the Anabaptists. But I think there's several lessons to be learned. One is that God doesn't forget his people. They go through suffering, yes. Some of them suffer untimely deaths. Some of them have painful, unpleasant experiences. But God never forgets us. The Lord Jesus Christ has called us his brethren. He said, "Don't call me master or Lord, call me brother." Jesus Christ was a true man, and he came to earth to care for us. He sits in heaven, ruling and reigning at the right hand of his Father, ever living to make intercession for us. And we can see in many of the experience of the Anabaptists of the 18th century that God was making intercession. The Son of God was making intercession with the Father for his dear children.